Hey everyone, we're with Border States. Our capstone project was the geoanalysis map. I'm Christian Ames.
I'm Austin Tadman.
Yuchen Li.
Jesse Knowlton.
So our company is Border State Electrics, and our sponsor is Alex Brook. Okay, today we're going to introduce company overviews, problem, solution, schedule, progress, product demo, issues, post-mortem summary, and next step. So, for company overview, Border State provides supply chain solution for several diverse industries. This is an employee-owned company, and there are 110 branches in 20 states. So, with a rapidly expanding, there is a problem they need to fix. They need to know where to open the new branches, and it's geographically proximate in relation to customers. They have the data, they just need to show it on the map. And so we have the following solutions. First, we build spatial analyze application on SAP cloud platform, and then we store branches and customers' data in SAP HANA, and then we use HereMap API to visualize geo content data.
Okay, and there's a couple different ways that this solution will be able to help border states. First, it'll strategically locate a new branch, so they can figure out if there's any gaps in any branch services. The second one being be able to determine if a potential acquisition is a good fit for them geographically as well as financially. And then I already touched on understand if there are any gaps in branch service. It'll also help them to understand if customers should be serviced by other branches. If one branch is closer to a customer, maybe they can be serviced from that one instead of another one, if it makes sense. And then a stretch goal of ours was to predict future revenue in a new branch, and there was some built-in tools with SAP that we could have used, but we unfortunately didn't get to that. So that would be something to look forward into in the future with this project. And our schedule, this was our what we planned to do from the start of the project to the midterm. So in Sprint 1, we were going to research SAP and HereMaps just to become familiar with the environments, because we were very green when it came to SAP. We didn't really know a lot about it. And then we were planning to set up our environment and import all the branch data that our sponsor had for us. And then in Sprint 2, we were actually going to plot the branch data on our map client and then associate that branch data with the markers, so that when you click on a marker, you're shown all the data related to that branch. And you can see down below, we had planned 3 out of our 7 user stories for Sprint 1 and 2, just because we knew there would be some lag with the research part of it. And our schedule from midterm to delivery, we planned on designing our UI in Sprint 3, importing the customer data, plotting the customers on the map, and associating the customer data with the markers, just like we did with the branch data, same process. And then finally in Sprint 4, we were going to implement our sales analysis tool, which allows the user to draw a parameter polygon on the map and then aggregate the data within the polygon to show any data related to the markers within that polygon, which we'll show you later. And then the remaining 4 of the 7 user stories were in Sprint 3 and Sprint 4. So progress, here's what actually happened. As you can see, Sprint 1, we got started very slowly. A lot of the research took longer than we thought, and there was an issue we had with granting certain privileges in SAP, which set us back about a week. So the only thing we accomplished in Sprint 1 was the research part of it. Sprint 2, we were able to finally set up our environment and start developing. We imported our branch data, we plotted the branches on the map, and we associated the branch data with the markers in Sprint 2. And then we even were able to get like a rough layout of our UI in Sprint 2. So we ended up meeting our goal for the midterm, which was great. And then finally, after the midterm, here's what happened. Sprint 3, we were able to get all the data with the customers, map them, and associate that data. And then we realized that we needed to update our UI in order to display sales data for the customers. So we made sure we did that. And then we did some research on a heat map, which is one of the cool things about here maps is you can actually implement a heat map to show concentration of sales data in certain areas. And we researched that, and we realized that wasn't really going to be something that would be visually pleasing for us, because in order to do that, certain customers had to have a lot of sales in regard to another one, and we weren't able to get actual sales data, so we had to randomly generate that stuff. So they were all kind of in the same area, so it really wouldn't have made much sense to have a heat map. But and then we also were able to finally set up our Git repository in Sprint 3, which we were accessing and manipulating the code all on the server, which was fine, but we really wanted some version control. And then finally in Sprint 4, there was a couple extra features that we decided to implement. One being Jesse had a backend mapping site that allowed us to see which locations in the database were actually mapped by here maps and which we needed to use other means of mapping for. So that was really cool, and he'll show you that. Christian implemented a color gradient with the customers where certain markers will show up lighter green or darker green with regards to how much sales that customer has. And then we were finally able to implement our sales tool with the polygons, and then actually add some filtering, so you can filter by state, by top 100 customers, top 50 customers, whatever you want. And then finally updated our UI to show those changes. So Jesse will have a demo here. Give us a moment.
Maybe let's go with the panel.
Sure. Whatever you
All right, so the first thing here, this wasn't necessarily planned from the start, but after some experimentation with geocoder and whatnot, it ended up being somewhat necessary. So when you first load this up, this is intended to be like a back-end panel, not for necessarily a front-end user. And the left side here shows you just information on the data. You click that scan button and it'll go through all of the customer data in the HANA tables and figure out which ones are mapped already, which ones still need to be mapped with the geocoder. And then it'll also ping the Here Maps API and the Google Maps API to tell you if your daily quota is used up, because there's a daily limit on how many calls you can make to each API. And Chrome gets a little upset with it running too slow, so it thinks it's unresponsive. But as soon as it comes up here, it'll show numbers in the map locations, non-map locations, and then it'll give you a yes or a no for the used up columns there.
We can go ahead and skip this and just
And then this right side over here, when you click this start button, it'll start going through each of the locations in the HANA tables and try to map them based on, okay, there, the left side just filled now. So you can see we have 1,126 of them mapped, and then there's still like 19,000 left to be mapped. And but on this right side, this slider right here controls the margin of error, basically, for the geocoder, because when you put in a text address, it can't necessarily associate that directly with like a point on a map. So you have to give it a margin of error for how it can find the lat and long for each address you throw it. And the Here Maps API has a lot of inconsistencies. So when we run through here, it'll start sweeping through, and it'll first try to use the Here Maps API, and if this checkbox is checked here, it'll then backfill with the Google API if it doesn't meet the relevance. And she's going a little slow again, so nothing started yet. But I'll just have you trust me that it works, and we'll just go over to the other side. Okay, and then here with our map, when you first load in here, alright, just give it a second here. Alright, there we go. First load in, the map would just be clear, centered on the US. You have two checkboxes here. You can check to show the branches, check to show customers, and then if you scroll over to the side here, by default it just has a global filter, so it just looks for any locations, and then it's set to display the top 50. I'll take the branches off so you can see them a little better. And so let's say you were to want to see 500 instead. You just throw an extra 0 on there, apply it, and it'll fill in 500 of the top ones now. Or if you wanted to go by a state and say you want to see 50 of them from Minnesota, you can apply that, and then shows you your top 50 in Minnesota. And when clicking on one, it'll show you all the basic location information in the table there, and then it also graphs out the sales data from the last 3 years here. And then the coolest new tool we've got is this data aggregation tool here. So if you check this box and then start clicking on the map, you'll draw a perimeter, and anything inside the perimeter that's currently displayed will then populate here. Well, the top 10 will show here, and then it'll show you your total down here. And if you uncheck this, you can just run back over to this page and say you want to see, like, well, this one looked pretty good in there. You can go look at all your sales data there. And that's more or less it for her.
So we obviously ran into a few issues throughout the course of development. I'll talk about those a little bit. All right, so first off, Austin touched on a little bit that no one had any experience with SAP, or really any of the tools except for like JavaScript and CSS that we were using throughout the course of development. So we had to familiarize ourselves with that. It was a little bit difficult because SAP uses some different syntax than is typically used in JavaScript libraries, so that was kind of something to wrap your head around, so that you knew that you, well, weren't going to mess up any of the tools that they provided to you. And then one of the sillier things that we experienced, which is why the research took so long in the first sprint, was that there are a bunch of users rather that SAP has you create at the beginning of development, and then it tells you, okay, now for the rest of development you're going to use the system user, and it just says in all capital letters, system user. And so we kept trying to use the different users that we had created, but it turns out that they literally just wanted us to put in system and then whatever password we had provided to them, which was probably the more embarrassing of any of the issues that we had. Another issue that we had within SAP, I don't know if you remember, but we didn't get the Git repository working until the third sprint, which is, I mean, that should have been done in the first or second sprint. That's just kind of a situation where we're not 100% clear if it was just because of the trial, but there are 3 different places that I ran into that you can make a repository in SAP, and we ended up like trying different ones when it says we can't find your project, or we tried a different one and it just doesn't load anything to show us that we can load our files. But turns out we had to synchronize one individual location with GitHub at a time, and then give it a very long amount of time before it says no data to show all of the files that we have, and then we're able to push it out to GitHub. It takes a while unless you really minimize the location that you're looking at. One of the bigger issues we also had was with here maps inaccuracies. Here maps is based out of Europe, and so it seems like they're just not, their coordinates aren't as tight with places in North America. And so if we give them a place like in Arizona, occasionally it will give us back a place that's in Arkansas or something like that, because that's what the relevance rate takes care of. And that's why we ended up having to backfill with Google Maps APIs. And the reason we can't just use Google Maps flat out is because it's going to be more expensive. But we may or may not have a few trials running for everything at the moment. And the reason is because either they are time-limited trials, or with the Google Maps you can only do so many in a day, and it would be it wouldn't work out so great if we had to be like, oh, let's cut off development with Google Maps for the day because we ran out of our quota. So we had to make a few of those. Postmortem summary. One of the things that we learned throughout the course of development is that it's a good idea to communicate often with the customer so that you don't get too deep into development with something that doesn't matter that much. We spent a lot of time on trying to figure out the inaccurate markers, like as an entire team, because we thought that was pretty much, if we can't figure that out, then that's just going to be an issue that is insurmountable and the whole project is not going to be worth anything. But then when we actually brought it to our sponsor Alex, he said, just leave that alone for right now, we can figure that out later. I'd rather that you get some other things figured out. It's also helpful to figure out the requirements immediately, and then because they were kind of unclear at the beginning, but we got them sorted out, and then progress went quite a bit smoother after that. Documenting early and often is also something that we learned was a good idea, because when we pass this over, we have user manuals that the user will be able to use, and developer manuals that the person who's going to be taking over development is going to use in order to fill out everything in their own system. And if you get behind on that, it's kind of difficult sometimes to remember, like, where were we and in what order did we do all these different development things, especially with SQL statements, because some of those are time sensitive in development. Also researching proactively. So if you're caught up on anything and only one person is looking into what the problem is, that doesn't mean that you can't be looking into the future at, like, well, we have some inaccurate map locations, so we can have another person look at the sales analysis portion with drawing the perimeter while one person is focusing on this. And then, you can kind of just branch out and accomplish a lot more things in the same amount of time. It's also we learned it was very helpful to discuss roadblocks in person, because pretty much every time that we had an issue that was a persistent issue, if we just met up together as a group and we talked about it for a little bit, this would often happen like after our sponsor meetings or during classes that we didn't have normal scheduled class time, we would be able to figure out our issue within 30 minutes or an hour just by taking everyone's little piece of information and putting it all together, and then everyone can work through the problem that way together. So the next steps that are remaining for the project would include Border States taking all of our code and following the developer manuals that I mentioned earlier, and then getting it imported into their system. They can just use the GitHub to take in the code, but then the specific steps and order of everything is going to be in the developer manual. And that's because we weren't actually able to get access to their internal, for security reasons, we weren't able to get access to their internal SAP system. Another thing, this was a stretch goal, but we didn't get to predictive analytics. It's also not clear exactly how helpful that's going to be, depending on how much data they have, just because basically it could tell you, well, you have a lot of sales here, so you can put in another branch, and then it's going to make more money naturally, right? Well, that's how a computer thinks, but that is not necessarily exactly how it's going to work. And then another thing could either be reformatting the addresses, or using Google Maps, or just keeping the relevance rate extremely high and then slowly feeding in addresses from Google Maps, because it's quite a bit more accurate than Here Maps is. That's pretty much everything that's left for development, and that is all we have. Does anyone have any questions?
There was talk about color gradients not being used, but
yeah.
Heat map being used.
It's the other way around, actually. So,
I'm sorry. Yeah. Did I miss seeing that? Or did you
it might have just not been so apparent on the screen.
Point that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you just move it up to like 1,000, okay.
information, so it'll be more obvious.
Okay.
And filter doll.
I think that worked. Yeah. And this is actually another issue, I would say, is we had to end up, instead of calling to the mapping API every single time, we ended up storing the latitude and longitude within the tables. So here's a good example of like, yeah, oh yeah, these ones are all quite a bit closer, where they just have slightly different tints of green, and it's just dynamic to whatever's the lowest sales to whatever's the highest sales that can possibly be had. And it's just a little bit more apparent if we do it this way than if, and I can tell you're having a hard time seeing. Yeah, well, yeah.
But there you can see the one over yonder is dark green.
I'll promise it's a little bit more apparent on this screen.
Yeah. So this is just another way that we found to distinguish between, at a glance, like which one has more sales, which one doesn't, than the heat map. The heat map really didn't show much. So.
Because it's just so concentrated, it's over the whole map, whereas now it's just concentrated points.
Yeah.
I guess the only other one, I like what you're doing.
Okay.
The Google pricing,
Yeah.
thing that you discussed that with them, do you know what they're planning to do?
We actually, this is all kind of happening recently where we figured out the panel and everything. And so we just kind of, well, Jesse had kind of jammed it in and then got it working before, just to, like as a proof of concept even. So we don't actually know exactly how they're going to move forward with it. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.